December 12, 2002. A pediatric nurse finishes her shift at St. John's Hospital in Springfield, Illinois, walks to her silver Honda Civic in the staff parking lot, and disappears. Security cameras capture Margaret Sullivan fumbling with her keys at 11:15 p.m., her breath visible in the bitter cold. She gets in her car, pulls onto Madison Street, and is never seen again. Her 10-year-old daughter, Bethany, stays awake, waiting for her mother's goodnight kiss. It never comes. At 2 a.m., her husband calls the police, trembling. 3 days later, they find Maggie's car abandoned near Lake Springfield, doors locked, purse inside with cash and credit cards untouched. But the driver's seat is pushed back too far for Maggie's 5'4" frame. Someone else had been behind that wheel. For 22 years, Springfield lived with an impossible question. What happened to Maggie Sullivan? Then in 2022, investigators discovered a pattern that would shock the entire community and reveal a predator who had been hiding in plain sight all along. Before we get into this case, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is at your location. And hit that subscribe button to follow along with us. That Thursday evening started like any other for Margaret Sullivan. Colleagues at St. John's Hospital remembered her moving through the pediatric ward with her usual warmth, checking on young patients recovering from surgeries, comforting frightened children in the middle of the night. Maggie had recently been promoted to head pediatric nurse, a position she'd earned through years of dedication. Her shift that night ran from 7 p.m. to 11 p.m., and by the time she clocked out, most of the hospital staff had already gone home. Security footage from the parking lot showed Maggie walking alone toward her silver Honda Civic at exactly 11:15 p.m. The video was grainy, black and white, but clear enough to see her movements. She wore her nurse's scrubs under a dark winter coat, her auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail. The temperature had dropped to 23 degrees, and you could see her breath hanging in the air as she searched through her bag for her keys. For a few seconds she fumbled with them, her hands probably numb from the cold. Then she unlocked the door, got inside, and started the engine. The taillights of her Honda glowed red as she pulled out of the parking space, turned left onto Madison Street, and drove into the December darkness. That grainy footage became the last confirmed sighting of Margaret Sullivan. At home, 10-year-old Bethany Sullivan refused to go to sleep. It was a Thursday night ritual. No matter how late her mother worked, Bethany always waited up for her goodnight kiss. Thomas Sullivan, Maggie's husband, had put their daughter to bed twice already, but she kept getting up, sitting on the living room couch with her favorite stuffed animal, eyes fixed on the front door. The drive from St. John's to their home in the quiet Springfield suburbs typically took no more than 20 minutes, even with light traffic. By midnight, Thomas started calling Maggie's cell phone. It rang and rang, going straight to voicemail each time. He told himself she probably stopped for gas, or maybe got held up talking to a colleague in the parking lot. But as the minutes crawled past 1 a.m, that reassurance crumbled. Thomas called the hospital. The night supervisor checked the parking lot and confirmed Maggie's car was gone. She'd left over 2 hours ago. At 2 a.m., Thomas Sullivan called the Springfield Police Department, his voice shaking with panic. His wife hadn't come home. She always came home. Officer Regina Martinez was one of the first responders dispatched to retrace Maggie's usual route. Her initial report noted that the roads were clear despite a light dusting of snow. There were no signs of an accident, no skid marks, no debris, nothing to suggest Maggie's Honda had veered off course or collided with anything. The winter night had been quiet, and Madison Street remained empty under the yellow glow of streetlights. Officer Martinez drove the entire route 3 times, checking side streets and parking lots. Nothing. By dawn, Springfield police had issued a missing person alert. Maggie's photo, a warm smile beneath auburn hair, green eyes crinkling at the corners, was broadcast on local news stations. The image of her in her nurse's scrubs, helping a young patient, became the face that appeared on missing person posters, plastered across Springfield within 48 hours. The local media swarmed the story. A dedicated nurse, a beloved mother, vanishing on her way home from work. It didn't make sense. The community responded immediately. Volunteers organized search parties, combing through parks and wooded areas around Springfield. St. John's Hospital staff held prayer vigils, lighting candles in the lobby where Maggie had walked thousands of times. Neighbors printed flyers and handed them out at grocery stores, gas stations, and community centers. Thomas and Bethany's phone rang constantly with offers of help, meals, and prayers. But despite the outpouring of support, despite the searches and the media coverage and the police patrols, no one could answer the one question that mattered. Where was Maggie Sullivan? On December 15th, 3 days after Maggie vanished, a jogger running along the shores of Lake Springfield spotted something odd, partially hidden, behind a cluster of trees near a remote access road. It was a silver Honda Civic, parked at an angle, covered in a thin layer of frost. The jogger called it in, and within the hour, police had confirmed the license plate. It was Maggie Sullivan's car. Detective Marcus Thompson arrived at the scene just after noon. He was a veteran investigator with the Springfield Police Department, known for his methodical approach and sharp eye for details that didn't add up. As he circled the vehicle, gloved hands testing the door handles, he immediately noticed the car was locked. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry. When officers unlocked it and opened the driver's side door, they found Maggie's black leather purse sitting on the passenger seat. Inside, $43 in cash, all her credit cards, her driver's license, and her cell phone. Nothing had been taken, but something was wrong. Detective Thompson slid into the driver's seat to get a feel for the scene, and his knees immediately hit the steering wheel. The seat was pushed back much further than it should have been. Thompson was 6 feet tall. Maggie Sullivan was 5'4". He made a note in his report. Someone taller had been driving this car. The discovery shifted everything. This wasn't a case of Maggie running away or getting lost. Someone else had been in her vehicle, and they'd left it in a location far from her usual route home. Detective Thompson ordered a full forensic sweep of the car. Fingerprints were lifted from the steering wheel, door handles, and dashboard. Trace evidence was collected from the seats and floor mats. Every detail mattered now. Meanwhile, the investigation took the route it always does in missing person cases. Start with the family. Thomas Sullivan was brought in for questioning, and though it was standard procedure, the scrutiny was painful. Detectives combed through his background, his finances, his schedule, but Thomas's alibi was rock solid. Security footage from his law firm showed him working late that night until just before midnight. Phone records confirmed he'd called Maggie multiple times, starting at 11:50 p.m. Co-workers vouched for him. There was nothing to suggest he was involved. Attention turned to St. John's Hospital. Detectives interviewed Maggie's colleagues, asking about her relationships, her routines, whether anyone had shown unusual interest in her. Most described her as kind, professional, someone who kept her personal life private. But then one nurse mentioned something that made Detective Thompson pause. About 2 months earlier, Maggie had filed a complaint with hospital security. She'd felt uncomfortable about a maintenance worker who seemed to appear wherever she was, in hallways outside patient rooms, near the staff parking lot, lingering by the nurses' station during her shifts. The complaint had been filed, logged, and apparently forgotten. Thompson pulled the report. The maintenance worker's name was Victor Ramirez. He'd been employed at St. John's for 5 years, working the evening and night shifts. Background checks at the time of his hiring had come back clean, but when detectives dug deeper, they found something troubling. Ramirez had used multiple aliases over the years. Different names, slightly altered social security numbers, addresses that didn't quite match up. It was a red flag that should have been caught, but somehow slipped through. Detectives immediately moved to locate Ramirez for questioning. They drove to the address listed in his employment file, a small apartment complex on the east side of Springfield. When they knocked, no one answered. A building manager let them inside. The apartment was empty, not just vacant, cleared out. No furniture, no personal belongings, nothing left behind except dust and the faint smell of old cigarettes. Neighbors said they hadn't seen Ramirez in days, maybe a week. He'd disappeared. Thompson stood in that empty apartment, jaw tight, knowing what this meant. A maintenance worker with multiple aliases, a complaint from Maggie just weeks before she vanished, and now he was gone. They had a suspect, but no way to find him. Despite widespread alerts and searches across Illinois, Victor Ramirez was never located. Weeks turned into months. The leads dried up. The media coverage faded, and slowly, painfully, the case file on Margaret Sullivan was moved into the cold case drawer, stamped with a red label that marked it as unsolved. If you've heard of a case like this in your community, let us know in the comments. And if you believe cases like Maggie's deserve to be solved, hit that like button and share this video so her story reaches more people. Years passed, but for the Sullivan family, time never moved forward. It stayed frozen on December 12, 2002. Thomas and Bethany created a website dedicated to finding Maggie. They called it Bring Maggie Home, and every year on her birthday, they updated it with new photos, new pleas for information, and messages that never stopped hoping. Mom, wherever you are, we're still looking. We'll never stop looking. Bethany would write those words even as she grew from a 10-year-old girl into a teenager, then a young woman. Bethany's childhood was marked by absence. She attended school dances without her mother there to take photos. She graduated high school in 2010, walking across the stage to accept her diploma while Thomas sat alone in the audience, holding an empty seat beside him. Every milestone, her first day of college, her 21st birthday, the day she decided to study nursing, carried the weight of someone missing. She chose nursing because of her mother, because she wanted to honor the woman who'd spent her life caring for sick children. In interviews years later, Bethany would say, "I became a nurse because I wanted to understand the kind of person my mom was. Every patient I help is a piece of her I get to keep alive." Thomas transformed from a husband into a widower who couldn't bury his wife, from a father into both parents at once. He never remarried. Friends would gently suggest he move on, but how do you move on when you don't have answers? When the person you love might still be out there somewhere, waiting to be found. In the living room of their home, Thomas kept a small shrine, Maggie's photo in her nurse's scrubs, a candle that burned every night, and the silver necklace she'd been wearing the last time he saw her, recovered from her car. He never moved it, never changed it. The community didn't forget either. Every December 12th, staff at St. John's Hospital held a candlelight vigil in Maggie's memory. Dozens of nurses, doctors, and community members would gather in the cold, holding candles, sharing stories about the woman who'd made them laugh, who'd stayed late to comfort frightened children, who'd been taken from them without explanation. For over 2 decades, those candles burned. But as the years stretched on, hope became harder to hold. The case file sat in the Illinois Cold Case Archives, one among hundreds of unsolved disappearances. Detectives retired. New investigators took over, glanced at the file, and set it aside for more recent cases with fresher leads. Victor Ramirez was never found. No new evidence surfaced. The trail had gone completely cold. Yet Thomas never stopped believing the truth would surface. On quiet nights, he'd sit in front of Maggie's photo and whisper, "Someday, we'll know. Someday, someone will find the answer." Bethany inherited that determination. She refused to let her mother become just another statistic, another forgotten name in a file cabinet. For 20 years, that hope flickered like the candle in their living room, barely holding on, but never going out. In 2022, 20 years after Maggie Sullivan disappeared, the Springfield Police Department made a decision that would change everything. They formed a dedicated cold case unit, a small team of detectives tasked with one mission: review unsolved cases with fresh eyes and new technology, and bring answers to families who'd been waiting decades for closure. Leading the unit was Detective Lisa Ramirez, a sharp, determined investigator with 15 years of experience in major crimes. When she first saw the name Ramirez in Maggie's case file, Victor Ramirez, the maintenance worker who'd vanished, she felt a personal drive to solve it. No relation, she'd clarify to anyone who asked, but seeing that name made me want to find out who he really was. Detective Ramirez and her team pulled Maggie Sullivan's file from the archives in early spring. The folder was thick with reports, witness statements, and photographs, but what caught her attention immediately was the evidence log. In 2002, forensic technology had been limited. DNA testing existed, but it was expensive, time-consuming, and often inconclusive with degraded samples. 20 years later, the science had advanced exponentially. Trace evidence that had been collected from Maggie's Honda Civic, swabs from the steering wheel, fibers from the seats, samples from the seatbelt, had been stored properly and preserved. It was still viable. Ramirez made the call. Send everything to the state forensic lab for advanced DNA analysis. The process took weeks. Technicians extracted genetic material from surfaces that had seemed too contaminated back in 2002. They isolated profiles, ran them through enhanced databases, cross-referenced them against millions of samples stored in state and federal systems. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in June, Detective Ramirez received a phone call that made her heart race. They had a match, but the match wasn't to Victor Ramirez. It was to an unsolved case from 2001 in Decatur, Illinois, about an hour and a half east of Springfield, an attempted abduction. The victim had been a nurse working the night shift at Decatur Memorial Hospital. She'd been walking to her car in the parking lot when a man approached her, tried to force her into his vehicle. She fought back, screaming, kicking, and managed to escape. She'd given police a description: white male, mid-30s, average height, wearing maintenance coveralls with a hospital ID badge clipped to his chest. He'd fled before police arrived, and despite an investigation, he was never identified. The nurse had been terrified, but alive. She'd scratched her attacker during the struggle, and DNA had been recovered from under her fingernails. That DNA had been sitting in the Illinois State Police database for over 20 years, waiting for a match. Now, it matched the DNA found in Maggie Sullivan's car. Detective Ramirez knew immediately what this meant. This wasn't random. This was a pattern. She reached out to Decatur police and requested every detail from the 2001 case. When the files arrived, the connections became impossible to ignore. The attempted abduction had occurred in a hospital parking lot. The attacker had been wearing maintenance coveralls. The victim was a female nurse working a night shift. It was the same predator. Ramirez expanded her search. She contacted hospitals across central Illinois, requesting employment records for maintenance staff from the late 1990s through the early 2000s. She cross-referenced names, social security numbers, and background checks. What she found was deeply disturbing. A man had worked at multiple Illinois medical facilities over the span of a decade, always in maintenance or janitorial roles, always on evening or night shifts. He moved from hospital to hospital every few years, sometimes leaving abruptly, sometimes simply not showing up for work one day. And each time he moved, he used a different name. In Decatur, in 2001, he'd been Victor Ruiz. At St. John's Hospital in Springfield in 2002, he'd been Victor Ramirez. At a clinic in Champaign in 1999, he'd been Roberto Kendricks. Slight variations, different social security numbers that were either fake or stolen, addresses that led nowhere. But the employment applications all had one thing in common: the same photo on the ID badge, same face, same person. His real name was Robert Kendrick, also known as Bobby. Background checks revealed Kendrick had a criminal history dating back to the early 1990s. Assault, harassment, stalking. He'd served time in county jail twice, both for incidents involving women. After his release, he'd learned how to disappear into the healthcare system, using aliases, targeting hospitals where background checks were less thorough, where overworked HR departments didn't catch the inconsistencies. And for over a decade, Robert Kendrick had moved through Illinois medical facilities, always near female staff, always watching, always waiting for an opportunity. Detective Ramirez sat in her office late one night, files spread across her desk, and realized the horrifying truth. Maggie Sullivan might not have been his only victim. She'd been one in a long line of women this man had targeted. The nurse in Decatur had survived. Maggie hadn't. The case was no longer just about finding out what happened to Maggie. It was about stopping a predator who'd been hiding in plain sight for decades. We want to hear from you. What do you think about cold case units reopening old investigations? Do you believe advances in DNA technology can bring justice even after decades? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. With Robert Kendrick identified as the primary suspect, Detective Lisa Ramirez knew the hard work was just beginning. Having a name wasn't enough. She needed evidence solid enough to bring charges, evidence that would hold up in court after 22 years. She started by going back to the original 2002 investigation files, reading every witness statement, every report, every note scribbled in the margins. What had detectives missed back then? What leads had been dismissed too quickly? The complaint Maggie filed about Victor Ramirez stood out immediately. It had been logged by hospital security, but never fully investigated. No follow-up interview with Ramirez. No questions asked about why a maintenance worker was consistently near the same nurse. It had been treated as minor, something that happened all the time in a busy hospital. That oversight had cost Maggie her life. Ramirez pulled employment records from St. John's Hospital. Kendrick, using the name Victor Ramirez, had started working there in 1998, 4 years before Maggie's disappearance. His shifts were always evenings and overnights, the same hours most nurses worked. Security logs showed he'd requested shift changes multiple times, and each time, those changes positioned him closer to areas where female staff parked their cars or entered and exited the building. It wasn't coincidence. It was calculated. She built a timeline. In 1999, Kendrick had worked at a clinic in Champaign under the name Roberto Kendricks. He'd left abruptly after 3 months. No exit interview, no forwarding address. In 2001, he appeared in Decatur as Victor Ruiz, working maintenance at Decatur Memorial Hospital. That's where the attempted abduction happened. The nurse who fought back and escaped. 2 weeks after that incident, Ruiz stopped showing up for work, disappeared. 6 months later, he surfaced again at St. John's in Springfield as Victor Ramirez. And in December 2002, Maggie Sullivan filed her complaint. 10 weeks later, she was dead. 3 days after her car was found, Victor Ramirez's apartment was empty. The pattern was clear, and it was terrifying. Detective Ramirez knew she needed to re-interview witnesses from 2002, even though 2 decades had passed. Some of Maggie's former colleagues had moved out of state. A few had passed away. But many still lived in Springfield, and several still worked at St. John's. Ramirez reached out to each one personally. One nurse, Janet Morrison, had worked the same shifts as Maggie back in 2002. When Ramirez sat down with her in a quiet coffee shop, Janet's memory was surprisingly sharp. "I remember Maggie mentioning that maintenance guy," Janet said, hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "She said he gave her a bad feeling. The way he'd show up right when she was leaving, like he knew her schedule. She tried to laugh it off, didn't want to seem paranoid. But I could tell it bothered her." Another former co-worker recalled seeing Ramirez in the parking lot multiple times, just standing near the employee entrance, smoking a cigarette, watching. "I thought it was weird," the woman admitted, "but I figured he was just on a break. Now, I wonder how many of us he was watching." Ramirez also tracked down hospital security footage archives. Most recordings from 2002 had been erased or recorded over, but the hospital had kept logbooks, handwritten entries noting who entered and exited the building and when. Those logs confirmed that on the night Maggie disappeared, Victor Ramirez had clocked out of his shift at 10:45 p.m., just 30 minutes before Maggie left. He would have had time to get to his vehicle, wait in the parking lot, and follow her. The Decatur survivor's testimony became critical. Ramirez drove to meet her, a woman now in her 50s who'd spent over 20 years looking over her shoulder, wondering if the man who'd attacked her would come back. When Ramirez showed her a photo lineup that included Robert Kendrick's booking photo from a 1994 arrest, the woman's hands started shaking. She pointed to Kendrick immediately. "That's him," she whispered. "I've never forgotten that face." She described the attack in detail, how he'd grabbed her from behind, tried to drag her toward a truck parked in a dark corner of the lot, how she'd screamed and fought until he let go and ran. Her description of his behavior matched everything Maggie had reported. He'd been watching her for weeks, showing up during her shifts, learning her routine. She'd felt his eyes on her, but didn't know how to explain it without sounding paranoid. Then one night, he made his move. She survived. Maggie didn't. Ramirez also discovered employment gaps in Kendrick's work history that aligned with other unsolved cases. In 2000, a nurse in Peoria had been reported missing for 3 days before her body was found in a wooded area outside the city. She'd worked at a hospital where a maintenance contractor named Robert Kendall had been employed briefly. In 2003, a medical assistant in Bloomington had been assaulted in her home. Police had questioned a former hospital janitor but couldn't gather enough evidence to charge him. That janitor had used the name Victor Ruiz. The scope of Kendrick's crimes was becoming devastatingly clear. This wasn't just about Maggie Sullivan. It was about a serial predator who'd spent years exploiting the healthcare system, targeting women who dedicated their lives to helping others. Because the pattern crossed state and county lines, Detective Ramirez contacted the FBI. Within days, a federal task force was assembled. Agents brought resources Springfield PD didn't have: access to national criminal databases, forensic experts, behavioral analysts who could profile Kendrick's methods. The FBI confirmed what Ramirez suspected. Robert Kendrick fit the profile of an organized offender, someone who planned his attacks carefully, used aliases to avoid detection, and moved frequently to stay ahead of law enforcement. Now, the question wasn't whether Kendrick was guilty. It was where he was hiding and how many victims he'd left behind. The breakthrough came from a routine traffic stop in Mattoon, Illinois, a small town about an hour southeast of Springfield. In August 2022, a local police officer pulled over a driver for expired registration tags. The man handed over a license with the name Richard Kent. The officer ran the information, and while the license appeared legitimate, something flagged in the system: a partial match to a person of interest in an active FBI investigation. Within hours, that information reached Detective Lisa Ramirez's desk. She pulled up the license photo and felt her pulse quicken. Richard Kent looked older, grayer, but the face was unmistakable. It was Robert Kendrick. He'd been living in Mattoon for nearly 3 years, working part-time at a hardware store, keeping a low profile in a quiet neighborhood where nobody asked questions. He'd changed his appearance slightly, grown a beard, put on weight, let his hair go silver, but he couldn't change his face, and he couldn't change his DNA. Detective Ramirez contacted the FBI, and within 48 hours, a warrant was issued for Robert Kendrick's arrest on charges of murder, kidnapping, and assault connected to multiple cases across Illinois. The warrant was based on DNA evidence linking him to Maggie Sullivan's car, the 2001 Decatur attempted abduction, and forensic connections to at least 2 other unsolved cases. The arrest was planned for early morning before sunrise, when suspects are least likely to run or resist. On August 18, 2022, a joint task force made up of FBI agents, Springfield detectives, and Mattoon police surrounded a small duplex on the east side of town. Detective Ramirez was there, wearing a bulletproof vest, her heart pounding as officers took positions around the building. At exactly 5:47 a.m., the lead agent knocked hard on the door. "FBI, open up!" There was silence, then the sound of footsteps inside. The door cracked open, and Robert Kendrick stood there in a wrinkled t-shirt and sweatpants, his face pale and confused. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice raspy from sleep. "Robert Kendrick, you're under arrest for the murder of Margaret Sullivan." His expression shifted immediately: shock, then calculation. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said quickly. "My name is Richard Kent. You've got the wrong guy." "Step outside with your hands up," the agent ordered. Kendrick hesitated, eyes darting toward the hallway behind him like he was considering running. But there was nowhere to go. Agents were already moving around the back of the house, blocking every exit. Slowly, he raised his hands and stepped onto the porch. Within seconds, he was on the ground, hands cuffed behind his back, officers reading him his rights while neighbors peered through windows, stunned. Inside the duplex, investigators found a space that looked disturbingly ordinary at first glance. A couch, a small television, a kitchen table cluttered with mail addressed to Richard Kent. But in the bedroom closet, hidden inside a locked metal box, they found items that made everyone in the room go silent. There were driver's licenses and hospital ID badges, at least a dozen, all with Kendrick's photo, but different names. There was a stack of old newspaper clippings, articles about missing women, about unsolved cases, about Maggie Sullivan's disappearance. And there were small personal items, a keychain, a bracelet, a hospital name tag, trophies, things taken from victims, kept as reminders. In a notebook buried beneath the box, investigators found handwritten entries that detailed his movements over the years, his thoughts about the women he'd watched, his justifications for what he'd done. The words on those pages left no doubt about who Robert Kendrick was, or what he'd been doing for decades. News of the arrest spread fast. By mid-morning, reporters were outside the Mattoon Police Department, cameras rolling as FBI agents loaded Kendrick into a transport vehicle. In Springfield, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Local news stations interrupted regular programming with breaking news alerts. Suspect arrested in 2002, murder of nurse Margaret Sullivan. People who'd followed the case for 20 years couldn't believe it. "He was still in Illinois this whole time?" one woman said on camera, shaking her head. "Just an hour away, living like nothing happened." Detective Ramirez made the call to Thomas Sullivan herself. She'd promised him from the beginning that if there was ever a break in the case, he'd hear it from her first. When Thomas answered the phone and heard the words, "We got him," he couldn't speak. He sat down heavily on the couch, the same couch where Bethany had waited up for Maggie 22 years ago, and he wept. Bethany was at work when her father called her. She stepped into an empty hospital corridor, listening as he told her Robert Kendrick had been arrested, that the man who took their mother was finally in custody. She leaned against the wall, tears streaming down her face, her nurse's scrubs reminding her of why she'd chosen this path. Later, in an interview, Bethany would say, "For so long, I became a nurse to honor my mom. Now I realize I'm also doing it to prove that people like him don't win. My mom saved lives, he took them, and I'm going to keep doing what she did, because that's what matters." Justice had taken 22 years, but it had finally arrived. In the days following Kendrick's arrest, Thomas Sullivan agreed to sit down for an interview with a local news station. He looked exhausted, older than his years, but there was something different in his eyes, a weight that had finally been lifted. "For 22 years, he said, voice thick with emotion, "I wondered if she left us, if we did something wrong, if maybe she was unhappy and just drove away. I know that sounds crazy, but when you don't have answers, your mind goes to dark places. You blame yourself. You replay every conversation, every argument, wondering if you could have changed something." He paused, wiping his eyes. "Now I know she didn't leave. She was taken from us, And knowing that, as horrible as it is, it's better than not knowing. Bethany spoke with reporters outside St. John's Hospital, where she now worked as a registered nurse. Standing in the same parking lot where her mother had disappeared, she was composed but fierce. "My mom didn't leave us," Bethany said firmly. "She was taken. That changes everything. For my whole life, I've carried this question mark. Now I know the truth, and I know she fought to come home to us. That's who she was, and now we're going to fight to make sure the man who took her never walks free." As the case moved toward trial, the prosecution team began assembling the evidence that would be presented in court. The DNA match was the cornerstone. Genetic material from Kendrick found on the seatbelt and steering wheel of Maggie's car, material that hadn't existed in any database back in 2002, but now tied him definitively to the scene. Forensic experts would testify about the science behind the match, the probability that it belonged to anyone other than Robert Kendrick. 1 in several billion. But DNA alone wasn't enough to tell the full story. Prosecutors planned to present a pattern of behavior: Kendrick's movements across Illinois hospitals, the aliases he used, the timeline of complaints and disappearances that followed him wherever he went. The Decatur survivor would take the stand, describing her 2001 attack in detail, explaining how the man who tried to abduct her matched the description of Victor Ramirez. Her testimony would show the jury that Maggie wasn't a random victim. She was part of a deliberate pattern. The defense, led by a public defender assigned to Kendrick's case, was already preparing counter-arguments. They'd likely claim the DNA evidence was circumstantial, that Kendrick could have been in Maggie's car for innocent reasons, a ride, a favor, something explainable. They'd point to the 22-year gap, suggesting that memories had faded, that witnesses couldn't be trusted after so long. They'd question whether the aliases proved guilt or simply showed a man trying to escape a troubled past. But the prosecution was ready. They had hospital security logs showing Kendrick's calculated shift changes. They had the complaint Maggie filed, proving she'd recognized the danger. They had the notebook found in his home, filled with his own words, his own admissions. And they had the voices of women who'd worked alongside Maggie, who'd felt the same unease, who were ready to testify that this wasn't paranoia, it was survival instinct ignored. St. John's Hospital staff rallied around the Sullivan family. Nurses who'd known Maggie, some now retired, came forward to offer testimony about her character, her dedication, her warmth. One nurse told prosecutors, "Maggie was the kind of person who stayed late to comfort a scared child, who remembered every patient's name. She didn't deserve what happened to her. None of them did." The case was clear. Robert Kendrick had targeted dedicated nurses who worked night shifts, women who parked in poorly lit lots, women who were vulnerable. Maggie had recognized the danger and reported it. The system failed to protect her. That failure had cost her life. If you believe cases like Maggie's deserve justice, hit that subscribe button and share this video. Cold cases only get solved when people refuse to forget. Let's make sure these stories reach as many people as possible. The trial of Robert Kendrick began in March 2023 at the Sangamon County Courthouse in Springfield. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with reporters, community members, former colleagues of Maggie's, and families of other victims who believed Kendrick had destroyed their lives too. Thomas and Bethany Sullivan sat in the front row, hands clasped together, bracing themselves for what was coming. The lead prosecutor, Assistant State's Attorney Michelle Garrett, stood before the jury and laid out the case with precision. She presented a timeline that stretched across 2 decades, showing how Robert Kendrick had moved through Illinois like a ghost, working at hospitals under different names, watching female staff, waiting for opportunities. She showed the jury employment records, security logs, and witness statements that painted a picture of calculated predation. This was not random, Garrett told the jury. This was a pattern. Robert Kendrick targeted women who dedicated their lives to caring for others. He used his position as a maintenance worker to learn their schedules, to access their workplaces, to follow them. And when Margaret Sullivan recognized what he was doing and reported him, he made sure she'd never report him again. The DNA evidence was presented by a forensic expert who explained in clear terms how genetic material recovered from Maggie's car matched Robert Kendrick's profile with a probability so high it was virtually impossible for it to belong to anyone else. The defense tried to argue contamination, mishandling, but the expert dismantled every objection with facts and science. Then the Decatur survivor took the stand. She was visibly nervous, hands trembling as she swore the oath, but her voice was steady when she spoke. She described the night in 2001 when a man in hospital coveralls grabbed her in the parking lot, tried to force her into his truck, how she fought and screamed until he ran. She identified Robert Kendrick as her attacker without hesitation. "I've seen his face in my nightmares for over 20 years, she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I knew if I ever saw him again, I'd recognize him. And that's him." Hospital records were entered as evidence, showing Kendrick's shift changes, his proximity to areas where female employees parked, the complaint Maggie had filed just weeks before she died. That complaint became Exhibit A, proof that she'd seen the danger, that she'd tried to protect herself, and that the system had failed her. The defense attorney did his job, suggesting coincidences, questioning timelines, pointing out that no one had witnessed Kendrick abduct Maggie. But the weight of evidence was overwhelming. Character witnesses testified about Maggie, a beloved nurse, a dedicated mother, someone who'd never just disappear. Co-workers described how she'd confided her fears about the maintenance worker who seemed to follow her. Then Thomas took the stand. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully, his voice breaking more than once. "We lost 22 years we could have had peace," he said. 22 years of birthdays, holidays, graduations, all of it clouded by not knowing. My daughter grew up without her mother, and I couldn't even tell her what happened. Now we know, and it doesn't bring Maggie back, but at least we're not living in the dark anymore. Bethany was called next. She wore her nurse's scrubs, having come straight from a shift at St. John's. She looked directly at the jury as she spoke. "I followed my mother's footsteps into nursing," she said. "Every patient I help is for her. Every life I touch is because she showed me what it means to care. He took her from us, but he didn't take what she built. I'm still here. She's still here through me." The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When they returned, the 4 women stood and delivered the verdict on each count. Guilty. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of kidnapping. Guilty. The courtroom erupted. Some people wept, others gasped. Thomas pulled Bethany into his arms, both of them shaking with relief and grief tangled together. Behind them, former co-workers of Maggie's held each other, crying openly. Robert Kendrick sat motionless at the defense table, his face blank, showing no emotion. 3 weeks later, sentencing took place. Under Illinois law, first-degree murder carried a mandatory sentence of 20 to 60 years, with the possibility of natural life for aggravating factors. Given the predatory nature of the crime, the pattern of behavior, and the additional charges, the judge sentenced Robert Kendrick to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiff led him away in handcuffs, Kendrick glanced once toward the Sullivan family. Thomas stared back, unblinking, until Kendrick looked away. Justice had taken 22 years, but it was final. Outside the courthouse after sentencing, Thomas and Bethany Sullivan stood together in front of a crowd of reporters and supporters. Thomas spoke first, his voice steady but emotional. "For 22 years, we've lived with a hole in our lives that couldn't be filled," he said. "Not knowing what happened to Maggie was torture. Now we know the truth, and as painful as it is, we can finally grieve properly. We can remember her without the constant question of where she is. She's at peace now, and so are we." Bethany added, "My mom dedicated her life to helping people. The fact that her death is now leading to changes that will protect other healthcare workers, that's her legacy continuing." And changes were already happening. In the months following Kendrick's conviction, Illinois hospitals implemented stronger security protocols. St. John's Hospital installed additional lighting in employee parking areas, increased security patrols during shift changes, and created a direct reporting system for staff who felt unsafe. Other medical facilities across the state followed suit, recognizing that Maggie's death had exposed dangerous gaps in workplace safety. The Springfield Police Department's cold case unit was vindicated. Detective Lisa Ramirez and her team had proven that persistence, combined with advancing technology, could bring answers even after decades. Their success inspired other law enforcement agencies across Illinois to dedicate resources to unsolved cases. Families who'd been waiting years, sometimes generations, for closure, suddenly had hope that their cases might be reopened, re-examined, and solved. Illinois Project Cold Case, a volunteer organization that advocates for victims' families, saw a surge in support. Donations increased, volunteer numbers grew, and public awareness about the importance of keeping cold cases alive reached new heights. Maggie Sullivan's name became a rallying cry. No case is too old, no victim forgotten. In Springfield, the annual December 12th, vigils at St. John's Hospital took on new meaning. What had been somber gatherings marked by grief now included celebration of justice served, of a community that never gave up, of a woman whose memory inspired real change. Candles still burned, but now they represented not just loss, but resilience. Bethany completed her nursing degree and continued working at St. John's, often in the same pediatric ward where her mother had spent her career. In interviews, she'd say, "Every day I go to work, I'm honoring my mom. Every child I comfort, every family I help, that's her living on through me. He tried to erase her, but she's more present now than ever." Detective Lisa Ramirez reflected on the case during a training session for other investigators. "Technology advances," she told the room, "but families never stop waiting. DNA testing is incredible, but it means nothing without the willingness to keep fighting for answers." Maggie's case took 22 years to solve because someone refused to let it die. The case also led to broader systemic changes. Illinois strengthened background check requirements for hospital employees, implementing multi-state employment tracking, so someone like Kendrick couldn't simply move from facility to facility under different names. Healthcare organizations across the country began sharing employment records and flagging suspicious patterns. Perhaps most importantly, Maggie's story underscored the critical importance of listening when employees report discomfort. Her complaint about Kendrick had been filed and ignored. That mistake cost her life. Now, hospitals train staff to take every concern seriously, to investigate thoroughly, and to prioritize employee safety over convenience. Maggie Sullivan's death was a tragedy, but her legacy became protection, awareness, and the unshakable belief that every victim deserves justice, no matter how long it takes. Maggie Sullivan's case teaches us something crucial. Justice delayed is not justice denied. For 22 years, her family waited. For 22 years, they lived with questions that had no answers. But they never stopped hoping, and investigators never stopped working. Cold cases aren't cold to the families living them. They're daily agony, uncertainty that follows you through every birthday, every holiday, every quiet moment when you wonder if today might finally bring the truth. Thomas and Bethany Sullivan carried that weight for more than 2 decades. They deserved answers, and eventually they got them. This case also proves that technology and tenacity combined can uncover truths that seemed buried forever. DNA science advanced. Detective Ramirez refused to let the file gather dust. Together, those two forces brought Robert Kendrick to justice. Maggie trusted her instincts. She filed a complaint because something felt wrong. Her instincts were right, but the system didn't listen. That failure cost her life, but it also taught a lesson that's now being applied across Illinois and beyond. When someone reports suspicious behavior, believe them. Investigate thoroughly. Trust their instincts because they might be seeing danger others miss. Every victim in a cold case is more than a name in a file. They're mothers and daughters, nurses and teachers, people who matter deeply to those who love them. Maggie Sullivan saved children's lives. She comforted frightened families. She was someone's whole world. Pattern recognition across jurisdictions helped connect her case to others, and that connection saved future lives. It shows why cold case units matter, why funding and support for these investigators is critical. No one should be forgotten. No family should wait forever. No victim should disappear into silence. When you see Maggie's photo, that warm smile in her nurse's scrubs, eyes full of kindness, remember she dedicated her life to healing. And when her life was stolen, investigators dedicated themselves to making sure her memory wasn't lost to oblivion. They saved her from being just another unsolved case. They gave her justice. If this story moved you, subscribe to keep following cases like Maggie's. Comment below with your thoughts on how the justice system can improve for cold case families. And share this video to spread awareness, because every share keeps these stories alive, and every story kept alive is a step closer to justice for someone still waiting.